Hello, I'm Matthew Gavidia. Today in the MGH Life Sciences and Medical World News, the Center for Biosimilars is pleased to welcome Dr. Wayne Winegarden, a senior fellow in business and economics at Pacific Research Institute, or PRI, as well as director of PRI Center for Medical Economics and Innovation. Providers want freedom to use the same biosimilar each time rather than have to use a different one according to each payer and formulary. Do you see any workable solutions to this problem?
Uh, you know, Absolutely. We're beginning to get into broader health insurance, healthcare reforms, and that is an essential part of kind of how do we get to a better healthcare system, right? Where the patient and the provider need to be in control of kind of that person's health, right? And so, to the extent that the provider is familiar with their patient, they understand what other medicines they're on, they understand kind of their unique circumstances. They're obviously much better positioned to know what the right medicine is, and so they absolutely need to be empowered. And the patient on the flip side should have that control because it's their health. Again, this is getting slightly away from specific biosimilar changes and into changes of how do we fundamentally improve how our healthcare system is operating from kind of that patient-centered, provider-centric healthcare model, which is absolutely incredibly important in terms of broader healthcare reforms.
Are there other reforms in the payer paradigm that you think might be workable?
There are. I mean, we talked about shared savings. We talked about fail first, separate biosimilar tiers, ASP reform, so that you have the same percentage markup or the same dollar markup across a biologic and a biosimilar. All of these types of reforms, again, the idea being that you're not disincenting or disadvantaging one product over the other. Along those lines, right now we have a lot of tie-ins on sales. Those can be anti-competitive, and those should be changed. So what we really need is a more efficient, less obstructed market so that the competitive pressures can come into play. We already see in the generics market that competition, drug competition is a very effective means for driving down price and improving quality of care and improving adherence, which improves health outcomes. That same process, it can be leveraged for the biologics market. And that all of those reforms that we're talking about need to work toward that specific goal.
You talk about regulatory inefficiencies. Can you discuss broadening the applicability of the interchangeable designation?
Interchangeability is one of those complex issues, and the really interesting issue in terms of biologics when we're talking about interchangeability is normally that refers to a pharmacist, and typically it's much more relevant for the small molecule drugs, where a pharmacist does a pharmacist have a right, or the ability, I guess is the better word, to change from a branded product to a generic product without going back to the physician, and you need that interchangeability designation to make that work. Often when we're talking about the biologics, it's being administered in a clinical setting. Well, in a clinical setting, when the doctor is administering it, the doctor can prescribe the medicine that they believe is most appropriate for that patient. So the whole interchangeability designation, for the most part, is not relevant. The doctor should, like we talked about earlier, the provider, the doctor, whoever's administering the medicine, they should have the right to use the medicine they feel is best for that patient, taking into account differences in costs. You have just as efficacious medicines, like a biosimilar to the originator, but one's cheaper. There's clear advantages to that. The doctor should have the ability to do that. And to the extent that the interchangeability issues are creating confusion about that, or creating hesitancy about that, we now have a regulatory obstruction. So to the extent that those issues are impacting our use of biosimilars, that is a very troubling regulatory policy.
Semglee, an insulin glargine, was approved as a 505(b)(2) application and deemed to be approved under the BPCIA. Although this is confusing, it doesn't acknowledge that it is a biosimilar. Biocon Biologics has to apply separately to get a biosimilar and an interchangeable designation. What are your thoughts on this?
Again, we need that clear pathway. And to the extent that we don't have that, that is problematic. I mean, one of the things about insulin is a lot of the affordability issues from insulin is actually coming from how we price drugs systemically, that gross to net bubble, where the patient's costs are based off of that gross price, the list price, which has been rising, but actually net costs have been going down. So, that's a very important concern when we talk about insulin, is fixing that problem, so that in effect, we're improving patients' affordability to actually reflect the market trends, not this inflated bubble. But with respect to the biosimilar versions, simply because insulin came in earlier, there's those complexities. I mean, I believe we're getting closer to getting that resolved. The quicker we can do that, the better. Again, more competition is always better than less. So we are making progress in terms of that with some of the changes that are being implemented. That is certainly favorable. Could it be more, efficient? Absolutely. And we need to push towards that.
President Trump has proposed to create foreign drug buying pathways for Americans so they can have access to cheaper drugs, particularly insulin. What's your take on this, particularly as it relates to Canada?
It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea if we relate to Canada, the UK, Europe. It is a bad idea for a number of reasons. First, let's think about Canada and let's think about the practical issues. There's 300 some odd million Americans. There's 30 some odd million Canadians. It's not possible for Canada to be the drugstore for the U.S. So that's, it's not a serious issue to address our drug affordability issues. I think more importantly, you have access issues in Canada. They have about access to 50% of the medicines that have come out over the last decade and a half or so. We have access to nearly 90% of those medicines. So, which, by the way, means if you have drug affordability, drug importation on those 40% of medicines that aren't available, you don't have drug importation. You can't import something that's not available. There's those problems as well. But you're importing all of those problems to the extent that you can get them into the US. You're just taking the Canadian price controls. Well, if you think price controls are the way to lower costs here, and it's not, we should have the courage to have that debate and do it here or not do it here. The problem with price controls is that you decrease the amount of innovation, so you harm patients in the future, you decrease access. All of the problems that you see in these other countries, you would import into the US. I think more importantly, there are ways to address drug affordability in the US that maintains that balance that we get right. We do this better than other countries, which is promote affordability and innovation, right? Look at the small molecule markets. 90% of small molecule drugs purchased over the pharmacy counter are generics. Most of those, 95% about, are going to be cost the patient of $20 or less. So we have affordable drugs and we have continued innovation because you have the incentive to cover the $2.9 billion it costs to develop a new drug, a new biologic, whatever the case may be. We have that balance struck well on the small molecule side. With respect to biologics, there's issues we have to talk about, the biosimilar competition. We have to address the pricing issue in terms of the gross to net bubble, where we have an incentive for gross prices to overinflate. It creates it's how the competition occurs. You really want competition on the net prices, on the market price. That would drive down the cost for the patients, but it would keep the systemic costs where they are. I don't think most people realize, if you look at the growth in net prices over the last 5-10 years, that's actually less than overall medical care inflation. So the problem is that the system that we have, the drug pricing system that we have, is shifting too much of the cost to patients, and that's what needs to be addressed. I go into that tangent because that's a much more effective way to create drug affordability here in the U.S. without bringing in all the problems that we would through drug importation and bringing in price controls. And we haven't even gotten into the issue of counterfeit drugs. If you open up the U.S. Drug markets to importation, you also expose us to this problem, which is already a large problem, right? We have some estimate is 10% of the market are counterfeit drugs. I mean, these are medicines that have yellow highway paint, gypsum. I mean, all sorts of. Sometimes they'll have a drug that it's not supposed to be there that you could be allergic to. Again, we're opening up the drug supply chain to greater infiltration by counterfeits, and that's dangerous to patients. For all of those reasons, importation just makes no sense.
British Columbia has noted significant savings on its mandatory switching since May 2019, and they've been able to plow substantial savings back into healthcare to improve access. Are there any lessons here that we can learn from?
I think the lessons are biosimilars, create systemic savings. Right? I mean, these are medicines that are just as efficacious, and that can lower overall spending. We don't need mandates. Again, this is something that the providers need to be in control of, along with the patient. I mean, that patient-centered proposal. But again, if you have a medicine that's just as efficacious, but it's much cheaper, why wouldn't you use it where it's appropriate? And so I think it demonstrates the real savings that we can generate here by just creating a more competitive market, not to go down that mandating route, but to remove the obstacles that are inhibiting a much more vibrant competitive market here in the US.
Can you discuss any current biosimilar legislation that you find promising or noteworthy?
To me, what I'm most excited about is more than legislation is the actual market dynamics that we're seeing. And I think that the growth in share that's occurring in the biosimilars market has been very encouraging, and we're beginning to see that market stand up. We're beginning to see the education, people recognizing how the potential savings the biosimilars offer, and how it actually is just as efficacious as the originator product. And as that continues to grow, as more companies continue to insist on favorable tiers for biosimilars and favorable terms, that could be very exciting for the future.
And lastly, as the FDA is busy with COVID-19 related issues, how is that affecting the pace of biosimilar approvals? And does the FDA have the resources it needs to do the job?
All hands on deck when the COVID has consequences. It has consequences across the board. You see that in clinical trials. And so obviously the faster we can overcome that, the better. But there are undoubtedly consequences because that it requires resources, and there's just a finite amount of resources. Things are still progressing, across the board. We're still seeing progress outside of the COVID area, whether it's innovation, whether it's drug approvals. I mean, all those hasn't come to a complete standstill, but undoubtedly, it's the focus, and rightly so, is on addressing COVID-19. And so it is the right thing to do, but as with so many things in the economy and society right now, COVID is front and center.
To learn more, visit our website at centerforbiosimilars.com. I'm Matthew Gavidia. Thanks for joining us.